Je croyais que j'étais un peu plus gros. C'est là dans le lien, c'est quand même sur le show, c'est vraiment affecté en ligature. Ja, dat taxi kost me sonst.
Nee, Customer kann es nicht, weil Customer kann es zu Hinsicht noch frei sein. Das geht nicht, weil das eigentlich ein Depense mit
So the subject of audits, financial and narrative reporting is one. It's a very practical subject, and there's a lot of detail, and it may very well be that's why academic interest tends to be at a sort of fairly peripheral level. So it brings together a number of things. We're looking at an amalgamation, I suppose, of company law principles in this area, dealing with the statutory audit and financial accounting, financial reporting, and the appropriate accounting standards. So that's a subject of UK statutory company law as fleshed out by case law. So an example would be case law on the true and fair view standard. That's a case law idea which sort of complements the existing statutory framework. Now, apart from accountants, I suppose not many people will write about these things, right? So if you're talking about the statutory standards, I would expect accountants to be interested in this, and of course lawyers. But those people who tend to talk about corporate governance do not deal with the details, right? Because obviously they're not, they don't have the sort of training for this, right? Since it requires some understanding of accounting and law. So that may explain why, notwithstanding the fact that the Code on Corporate Governance was instigated and brought about by a financial disaster, i.e. problems with the audit process, problems with accounting statements. Notwithstanding that, the books in this area tend to ignore this. So they talk about it and talk about the failure of accounting. So if you look at, if we kind of go back to the Code on Corporate Governance, this came in after the Maxwell collapse. So Maxwell, there was a company called Maxwell, which was a major global company, and the head of Maxwell was a very forceful character called Robert Maxwell, who apparently committed suicide. And when he committed suicide, they then discovered that there was a big hole in the financial statements. He had basically depleted the pension funds of the company. So this was a major, major problem. And it was around this period that Sir Adrian Cadbury began to do work on the Code on Corporate Governance. And think about it, the word and the name of the original code was this. It was a code to look into the financial aspects of corporate governance. That was the title, right? It was a code to look into the financial aspects of corporate governance. So my point basically is that if we ask the question, where did the code come from? The code came from these accounting violations, these problems of accounting and financial reporting. That's the genesis in the UK, right? And from that origin, we had the Code on Corporate Governance. And this is not unique to the UK. Take the case of the United States. You had Enron. Again, that had to do with serious financial irregularities. And the consequence of this was that we had the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, right? So, so it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting that even though financial financial problems pertaining to accounting and reporting, have always led to strong regulatory intervention, i.e. leading to the Code on Corporate Governance. The literature on the subject tends to deal with it at a more thematic level. It deals with it at a more thematic level beyond sort of telling us about the problem. So I was looking at the sort of latest book on the subject, and if you look at chapter 19, it does not, which deals with this, it does not deal with anything, not one, and I wasn't exaggerating when I said not one single issue that I touch upon is dealt with. So the theme of that chapter is, from memory, is global aspirations and local realities. That's how they phrased it. So when writers write like this, you know that it's going to be a bit sort of thematic. So global aspirations, they're talking about, convergence in accounting standards. They're talking about convergence in accounting standards. But local realities, they're talking about the problem of the law at the local level, at the domestic level, still being predominant. In other words, you get this clash between, I suppose, convergence and the law at the local level. And the writers in that chapter then go on to tell us about how accounting, the way they put it, how accounting contributes to globalization. And as part of the story, the struggle for convergence is part of this. So they kind of go into general accounting standards, selling the history of accounting standards. But nevertheless, they conclude that accounting remains a local language, right? Ultimately, it's local, and therefore they're basically saying you've got to look into your corporate law code. So, for instance, in the UK, we will talk about the true and fair view. In other legal systems, there will be something else. Certainly in civilian legal systems, I suppose there will be some kind of concept that equates to being straightforward and being truthful. But ultimately, the point here is that we're talking about a standard which is local to each particular country. And so essentially that's how they basically deal with it. And there's a slight section in that report, in that chapter on corporate governance of about maybe a page. And again, it's still all in the air, no detail, right? So this is basically the point I'm trying to get across. On the other hand, if you look at company law books, which I try not to ask you to do because it'll just get you too much into the detail of the minutiae of British company law. So if you take Gower on company law, then it will give you a lot of detail about the statutory audit, right? Too much detail, not necessary for corporate governance. So in a sense, so the choice we have basically is a highly thematic treatment which leaves you ill-equipped to advise a company on what needs to go into this area. So between a highly thematic approach to a highly specific treatment from a company law perspective, which, by the way, gives an incomplete picture. So there's a lot of detail, but still incomplete because it only focuses on company law, not the corporate governance side. Between these two extremes, I thought the best way to deal with this would be to look at what goes on in practice, right? And when I say look at what goes on in practice, I'm not plucking it out from the air. I'm not sort of saying, let's just see what people do detached from some regulatory code. No, far from it. That's not what I'm doing. I'm basically saying, let us see how the law shapes practice, right? And my hope is that by the time we finish this, then you'll sort of understand what the issues are, and indeed you should be able to advise a company on the broad issues, right? So I work from the practice of companies based on the law, and then connect it with the guidance documents and the code on corporate governance issued by the Financial Reporting Council, right? So those are the primary documents, and any other case law. So for instance, the Macquarie case on the true and fair view would be a case to look at, or the Allied Carpets case on not cooking the books, right? So that's I hope you understand the approach. Okay, so essentially, what do we mean when we talk about financial reporting and narrative reporting? Sorry. I suppose the idea of financial reporting is to, as I say here, it really stems from the possibility of people cooking the books, applying the same accounting standard, but basically treating things slightly differently. That used to be the problem of the possibility of different accounting treatments being applied to the same facts and leading to different results. So the whole idea of accounting standards is to try to limit that, right, by having some, having standards of accounting principles, so IFRS and all that. And then there's also the other problem of fraud, right? So fraud is the second one. And then the third one is that of complexity. The idea basically is that if you really want to mislead people, then make it complex enough, and that way they will not understand, right? So we're talking about the possibility of different accounting treatments. We're talking about the problem of fraudulent misrepresentation. We're talking about unnecessary complexity, right? Those are the key themes I want us to sort of keep in mind. And underlying this is the problem of informational asymmetry, right? Which, as you know by now, that's really the core problem in corporate governance. There is a problem of informational asymmetry. The agents who manage the company have more information than the investors, right? So the idea basically is to force those who manage the company to give an account of their stewardship. That's the essence of corporate governance, to give an account of their stewardship without fraud, without lying, without complexity, and basically to explain what they're doing in simple language, hence the subject of narrative reporting. So narrative reporting, therefore, becomes a supplement to financial reporting. And so the Companies Act Strategic Report Directors Report Regulations has now introduced a duty to prepare strategic reports. So when I talked about looking at what companies do, looking at the practice, that's part of it. We're going to look at the strategic report. The reason is that the strategic report is linked to Section 172. Why do I say this? You know, when we talk about Section 172, we talk about the duty to promote the success of the company. And some people would say, well, what's so special about this duty? This duty which none of the stakeholders can enforce. the workers cannot enforce it, right? So that's usually the critique, isn't it? People always say, well, it's a paper tiger. Nobody can enforce it. Certainly the workers can't enforce it. And to which I would say, well, those duties owed by directors usually are not even enforceable by the members. Their duties are owed to the company, right? And the only way you enforce the duty would be through a decision on the part of the company to enforce it through litigation, or if the company has been taken over and then there's a new management that wishes to enforce. But you may still say, well, that's no answer, right? The bottom line is that the stakeholders that we care so much about cannot enforce. And therefore, what does 172 do? Some people would even go a stage further to say 172 simply reduces the accountability of management, because management now have a range of reasons to give that would mean that they will not be accountable ultimately, because if you are accountable to too many people, then you're accountable to no one. That would be the argument. And so the government has been very concerned about this, and what the government has done is to say, we will use the strategic reports as a way of you communicating to the market, to the public, how you have discharged your duty in 172. So anybody who talks about 172 in isolation, in a sense, is not seeing the full picture. You cannot discuss 172 without the strategic report, because that's the tool. And indeed, if you look at the BAE reports, right, BAE Systems, BAE, they make weapons, right? And it's a big company. Last time we met, we talked about, was it last time or the time before, we talked about Lord Wolf's report on risk. And so it was done for BAE Systems, and that report is quite influential. And so it's a very big company. And if you look at the report from its annual accounts / reports, you will see a statement on section 172, which essentially links to, which is essentially made in the context of the strategic report. So please bear that link in mind, and I'll just take you there. So here, we're talking about perusing the extracts, and I'm talking about BA systems. So let me just quickly, go there and just quickly pull it out. So that's BA Systems Report, 2017. And essentially, you can see it is making a strategic report, and it's all about 172. It's all about 172. Right? And it shows so much, it shows how much you've learned in this, I hope in this course, that everything here would be immediately recognizable, right? In other words, if BAE paid you to do it, you could do it, right? So here we have BA Systems basically talking about the duties of directors. You have to act in accordance with certain duties, right? The directors are briefed on their duties. And it says it's important to bear in mind that in a company such as BA Systems, the directors basically fulfill their duties partly through a governance framework that delegates day-to-day decision-making to the officials of the company. Usually, there will be an operational framework to guide this process, right? There will be an operational framework. So the operational framework, which is a document, and I've not talked about this, but basically, in terms of what I've done so far is to say, they will delegate, right, management to the managers. Then if you ask the question, how do they delegate? Precisely what do they do? All right? The board is not going to do day-to-day management. So presumably what the board will do is delegate authorizations, right? So the CEO can enter into contracts of this amount, You can take litigation, on this basis, but if it impinges or if it touches a certain amount, you basically bring it to the board, So the operational framework would set these things out, right? So again, here we see, the report basically talking about the values that the board basically would need to comply with, and therefore the company, right? Then, so it produces section 172 there. And then again, you see the subject of values, right? Now, remember some time ago I talked about the killing of Khashoggi, and the suspicion that the Saudi, at least elements in the Saudi government were behind it. And this has obviously caused a lot of problems. And when you consider the fact that BAE sells a lot of arms to Saudi Arabia, these are the sort of issues that you would expect the company to grapple with. Obviously, I'm not saying it's big enough now, right? It's still being controlled. The last time I kind of looked at it, I noticed Putin was giving MBS a high five enthusiastically. But the point is that if the noise becomes too much, and I'm not too sure how it's going to go, but if it becomes too much and you get NGOs moving in and a lot of advocacy campaigns being waged, then they will come under pressure. That's how it works, right? Because in the absence of a sanction or some kind of embargo by the nation state, it is these civil actors that cause companies to change. So it's narrow to simply say, well, Saudi Arabia is not under any sanctions. It's not as simple as that. If the noise gets loud enough, and I'm referring to activities of NGOs, then it may become important for the company to have to engage with the problem. Obviously, we know that they will not like to do that at this stage. And then, again, you see here, it talks about risk management, which we've basically looked at, and how it manages risk. Right? And then here, notice, yes, this is what I mentioned earlier, the operational framework document. Right? So the operational framework document documents the roles of the directors and executive management, detailing how and by whom decisions are to be made. Right? So all that basically goes in there. So that's basically what the strategic report. This is just part of it, and I'm just going to talk through other aspects as we go along. And again, if you look at the Sainsbury's report, here you see a statement of viability. So basically, what Sainsbury's is doing is communicating to the market that we are a viable company, and that, i.e., we're looking a few years ahead, and we believe on the basis of certain indicators the company will remain viable, i.e., not only is the company a going concern today, but it will remain viable. And they do a lot of scenario planning, right? So they take the principal risks of the company and kind of magnify them, almost like, kind of stress testing, right? So you take the significant risks of Tesco, sorry, not Tesco, Sainsbury's. Yeah. I don't shop with them, so. So and then you kind of magnify, you magnify it. So and if you think about the scenario risks, I mean there will be risks with the regulators. So every industry has its own regulator. So here we'll be looking at the regulator of I can't remember the name now, but there is a regulator that sort of deals with supermarkets and produce and all that, right? So there'll be regulatory/compliance risk, which we talked about last time, because they have the power to issue fines. So you need to capture that just in case those fines become mega. There will be data risk, data breach risk, right? We all know that the GDR was just passed, right? Which basically introduces new levels of risk. Again, that would be, because if people's accounts have been hacked, if the company's accounts have been hacked, cyber risk, cyber security, then you need to sort of factor that in. And we all know that this happens pretty often. There'll be financial risk, right? So financial risk, you're looking at treasury management, how much we borrow, what interest rates will be like, and of course, normally you'll be looking at your business, right? How if your market, reduces or constricts, how will this affect your business? So here, you see Sainsbury's looking at various scenarios. So here, it's talking about. Let's just focus on data. So the impact of any regulatory fines has been considered. The biggest of these is the General Data Protection Regulation fine of data breaches, which were enacted in 2018. So they kind of try to capture this and say what could really go wrong, right? And then also you're thinking about compliance risk, legal breaches, right? So health and safety standards. So here they model a 2% fall in budget sales volumes of each year based on that. Right, so you're taking, so basically what you're doing is, the board is, as part of its narrative reporting, it is going back to risk management. Remember we talked about risk management, we talked about identifying the principal risks that your business faces. What are the principal risks? What are the emerging risks and the likelihood of them manifesting? And then funneling this into your annual report to report to your shareholders, right? Not just by means of figures, but through narrative reporting, basically saying these are the risks, and we've thought about them. And by the way, our audit committee, because usually you may not have a separate risk management committee, in which case the audit committee will be the one to deal with this. Our audit committee is on top of it, right? Okay, then again, here you have Convatec. Convatec is a company which, what I've done basically, by the way, is selected best statements, sort of very good statements that I thought really were, because not all companies are this detailed, right? So the idea was to take elements from different companies and produce them to say, these are fine examples of narrative reporting. So here we see the Audit and Risk Committee report, and we'll talk about this when I start talking about the audit, right? Because you'll see that the statements here really resonate with some of the points I make about the Audit Committee, right? So that continues. Then you have the remuneration. So that's a statement on remuneration from Rolls-Royce. And then Lloyds Bank, again, the strategic report talks about non-financial information down to climate change, really giving the market a lot of information. And you see here, you see here how detailed it is, right? So they're looking, so if you look at just human rights, they bring so many things together, from anti-slavery, information cybersecurity, data privacy, and all that, and bring them together. And then now, as you know, gender is also a big issue, diversity, right? So again, if you look at Virgin Money, there's a very good statement on that, and Women in Finance Charter, right? And so reporting gender balance. So that's them, right? So there's a lot of, you can see how corporate governance has grown, right? You know, and these issues are all big issues, right? So sometimes when people talk about, you know, women on the board, gender diversity, you know, the idea basically is to step back and say, why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because we believe that if you structure a board in the right way, and we believe that diversity is always good, right? It's always better to have, I mean, just think about risk. If you bring the same people to analyze risk, they're all going to look at it from the same viewpoint. But if you bring different people, then you're able to capture different types of risks. Last time I was talking about the importance of having lawyers on the board, right? Because you know, we're trained to see risks, right? Okay. Okay. Now, so what I'll do is talk about instruments of the solution to solve this problem of informational asymmetry, right? Because remember, that's a big problem, informational asymmetry. You know, what the executives know is not equivalent to what the shareholders know. And so we want to sort of level things out. And remember, we said the best way to do it is to have financial reporting and narrative reporting. So my way of doing it is to say, let's deal with it under the Code on Corporate Governance. Let's see how the Code on Corporate Governance basically deals with this. What are the principles? What are the relevant principles of the Code on Corporate Governance? And then we'll look at, beyond the Code on Corporate Governance, we'll then move to the Financial Reporting Council's guidance on audits, right? And then after that, we'll then look at how the law deals with this. And when you're looking at how the law deals with it, then we're looking at the law on financial statements, you know, true and fair view and all that, right? Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so that's what we just kind of went through. Okay, so we're looking at instruments of the solution to the problem. Does anybody have any questions so far? What is everything? Does it make sense to you? Okay, here you'll see that the Code on Corporate Governance, as you know, the Code on Corporate Governance, I hope you've been looking at the code. It's a short document compared to previous years. It was much longer. Now it's kind of short. So as you know, the code is divided into sections. And now we're dealing with Section 4. Section 4 deals with the audit, right? So when you look at Section 4, you'll see that there are two relevant principles here, principles M and N, right? And the principles are the ones that are set out there, that the board should establish formal and transparent policies to ensure the independence and effectiveness of the internal and external audit functions. Right. So within a company, not all companies have this, but a lot of companies will have an internal audit, right? So you have an internal auditor, and then of course there'll be the external audit, and it's essentially saying that the board should establish a formal and transparent, system for this to work. so that the board is in a position to satisfy itself of the integrity of the financial and narrative statements, right? And then principle N, the board should present a fair, balanced, and understandable assessment of the company's position and prospects. You see, those two principles speak to what we identified at the very beginning, the problem of fraud, the problem of misrepresentation, the problem of complexity, right? Those are the three things, right? And underpinning these three is an informational asymmetry. So, you know, so that's really the central problem. That's really the central problem. I mean, let me sort of unpack, you know, different accounting treatments. You know, so let's imagine you have a policy of you know, selling, let's say, carpets, and people come to your store and they buy. Well, so you're the chief financial officer, and you say to all sales managers that whenever you conclude a contract to sell your carpets, always book it as revenue, notwithstanding the fact that people have a right to return. I mean, you think about it, you know, think about, you know, people who buy stuff from these online retailers. I was reading a survey recently, it was in the news, about there being people who just love to buy things and return. Right? They love it. You know, I've never, you know, I never just, you know, it's too much of a hassle, right? But apparently, some people love to try things and return, right? Now, if you have a policy of prematurely booking, and I suppose the operative word is prematurely, if you have a policy of prematurely booking it to revenue, you're treating it as if a sale has occurred, and yet it can be brought back, then you will be given a wrong impression of your financial statements. Now, and that will have serious consequences, because that means that a premature booking to revenue will flout UK General Accounting Standards. And if it flouts UK General Accounting Standards, it then means that your accounts do not give a true and fair view. And if it means your accounts do not give a true and fair view, it then means that that's serious. It means that if you pay a dividend, for instance, your dividend will be unlawful, right? Because, you know, before you pay a dividend, and I just made a dividend, I gave a dividend as an example. Before you pay a dividend, your accounts must, you must be able to demonstrate you have sufficient distributable profits. And to demonstrate that you have sufficient distributable profits, your accounts should give a true and fair view. Now, this is a technical issue. It has nothing to do with the amount of money you have, right? So you could have loads of money, but just because there is a technical violation, i.e., you know, your accounts do not give a true and fair view, then the dividends will be unlawfully paid. Now, to just tell you how serious this is, it means that if you are the director who authorized the payment of that dividend, you will have to refund it to the company. That's what it means. You would have to repay it to the company. And by the way, the shareholders can then cause you, after repaying it to the company, to pay it out again to them, right, when the accounts have been rectified. Did you get the point I'm making? So imagine, I mean, I'm sure you missed it. So the company has lots of money. So imagine the company has 50 million as distributable profits. And the company then paid out a dividend of, let's say, 5 million. So it has a lot of money. It pays out 5 million. But there is a technical violation, right? I've given you one example of a technical violation, which is that the accounts do not give a true and fair view. And the source of this technical violation is the practice of booking to revenue prematurely, right? So that then means your accounts do not give a true and fair view. It therefore means that the payment of a dividend is unlawful, even though you have money. So the shareholders can force you, the directors, right, who have misapplied trust property, right, because it's trust property, you know. They can force you to repay this money to the company, right? So you're going to sell all your houses and bring the money to the company. And then they would say, now, okay, now we're going to rectify it. Let's correct the accounting irregularity. now please pay us a dividend again, right? So that this time around we'll also keep it. So basically they get the money twice. Did you get a point? They get the money twice. Yeah.
I'm sorry. So what I understand, so the audit committee is composed by directors. So they are members of the board, and within these members are chosen directors that are part of audit committee. It's not, for example, audit committee is composed from third parties that come out from, I don't know, consultancy company as, I don't know, EY or Deloitte or Accenture or something like that. No, they are, in any case, member of the boards.
Yes, yes, yes. So I'll come to that in a minute. But you're right. They're members of the board. I'll come to that. I think that the point I was making was I was still dealing with the core principles, right? Just showing how important this is, in the sense that when I said the board should present a fair, balanced, and understandable assessment of the company's position and prospects, and should basically satisfy itself on the integrity of the financial statements. What does that mean? What does that mean to satisfy yourself about the integrity of the financial statements? So I was giving life to that by saying that you want to be able to rely on the financial statements, and I've given an example of how the financial statements could be defective, right? It could be defective because of the way you treated your sales. And if it is that defective, right, because of the way you treated sales, then it then has consequences which cascade. And then I gave you an example of how it could cascade, right? That's the point. I hope that bit is clear. I wasn't digressing. I just wanted to be. It's one thing for me to say to you that, well, there should be integrity to financial statements, but what does that mean practically? And I thought the best way to illustrate this is to use this particular example. And indeed, if you look here, because that is a legal issue, isn't it? It's a legal issue. If you look, at the Companies Act provisions, Allied Carpets Nethercott. That is precisely what happened in that case, right? That is what happened in that case. Now, but remember, at this stage, I simply digressed to talk about a legal issue, not a corporate governance issue, right? But just a legal issue. Because, the corporate governance does not deal with the law. The law deals with the consequences of a violation. So the law lays down the standards and it deals with the consequences of a violation. Corporate governance is simply saying that you need to have an effective board to comply with the law, right? An effective board will be one which will have processes in place to ensure that financial statements have integrity. If financial statements have integrity, then financial statements will not breach the law. But if financial statements breach the law, then these consequences that I talked about in Allied Carpets will follow, and it will cascade and affect many things, right? So let's go back to the corporate governance issues. So here it says that if you look at code, the Code on Corporate Governance, Section 4, if you look at Provision 24, it basically says that the board should establish an audit committee of independent non-executive directors. Let's just stop there. Now, remember, Principle M talks about having procedures to ensure the independence and effectiveness of internal and external audit functions. Internal audit functions will simply be some accountant you have employed to be your internal auditor, right? So we want the internal accountant who is your internal auditor to, at the very least, be able to bring his concerns, not just to the CEO, but to an audit committee, right, which we'll talk about. So the starting point must be the internal, auditor. And you then have an external auditor, which I come to your question, although you didn't put it this way, but the external auditor would be from an accounting firm, right? And the external auditor is external, right? He's not a member of your company. He's external. And indeed, I will show you here, I talk about who, right? I talk about the audit process. So which companies must have an auditor? All companies unless exempted, right? So I'm talking about the external auditor now. All companies must have an auditor unless they're exempted, i.e. small companies. Who may be an auditor? So that addresses the subtext to your question. Anyone, you've got to pass the accounting exams. Anyone, if they meet eligibility requirements. I like that, when I was writing that. Anyway, so basically, they have to be a member of a recognized supervisory body, right? So you're talking about the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and then this external person has to be independent, right? Right. So Section 1214 of the Companies Act requires the independence of the statutory auditor. Right? Okay. Now, we are not at this stage dealing with this guy, right? We are now looking at the audit committee, all right? Because the Code on Corporate Governance focuses on the audit committee. The Code on Corporate Governance does not focus on the internal auditor, right, or the external auditor, albeit tangentially. It focuses mainly on the audit committee, and then it tells the audit committee how to relate to the internal auditor and external auditor, right? Now, so you ask the question, where do these guys come from? They have to be directors, right? The audit committee is a committee of your board. Remember, corporate governance is about structure, process, values. So this committee is a structural issue, right? And not only should they be a committee of your board, they should be independent, right? They should be independent. They should be non-executive directors, so independent non-executive directors, with a minimum membership of 3. On the case of smaller companies, 2. And the chair of the board should not be a member. And at least one of them should have relevant financial experience. Now, here I then say to you, recall the problem question, right? Because remember, the problem question we looked at dealt with some legal issues and some corporate governance issues. And so as I recall, the audit committee had a lot of executive members, right? So the question basically is expecting you to flag that up, to say, wait a minute, if these guys are to be the watchdogs, how come it is people from the company who are on the audit committee, right? Right, so that's one. And if you remember, the problem question basically said the chairman was a member of the audit committee. Remember? The question we looked at, you forgot. So the chairman of the company was also a member of the audit committee. Again, that's wrong. It's there, right? And so you want to bear that in mind. And then, if you remember, at the very beginning of the course, we talked about Iris Chu's paper. Thank you. Someone remembered. We talked about Iris Chu's paper, and Iris Chu in that paper, the argument was, let us find a way to institutionalize corporate governance norms by moving these norms from the Code on Corporate Governance and not making them law, but putting them in the articles, right, thereby institutionalizing. That was a core argument. And I said, okay, fair enough, if you do it this way, then how is it enforceable? Because if you put in the articles, members of the board cannot enforce it, right? Because it's an outsider right. They will not be able to enforce it. And I gave, to illustrate the problem, I said, let's test it. Let's imagine the audit committee did not have the resources. Because an audit committee is only as effective as the resources it has. If the audit committee, for instance, gets a report from the internal auditor telling them that the CEO may have committed fraud, right? The audit committee will need to get an accounting firm, right, to investigate, a forensic accounting firm to investigate, or a law firm to investigate, and that costs money. So if the audit committee does not have the resources at its disposal, then it is not effective. Okay, so those are some of the things you want to look at practically, and maybe, I suppose for purposes of exams. I'll be looking at, do they have an audit committee? How is the audit committee composed? Is it independent? How is it resourced? How often do they meet? Those are the things I'll be looking at. So here again, if you look at the functions of the audit committee, so you see here it is monitoring the integrity of financial statements. So although the board has the duty, right, to satisfy itself that these financial statements have integrity, the audit committee is given a special role, right? So they're the ones, that's why you need somebody who can read a balance sheet, somebody who understands figures, right, to grapple with it, right, okay? And the other point is the audit committee also reviews the company's financial controls and internal control and risk management systems, unless, of course, you have a separate risk management committee. Remember when we talked about risk management, I did say last time we met that the audit committee basically does this. But I suppose in one of the questions we looked at, there was a separate risk management committee, right? Remember? There was a separate risk management committee which did not do its job, right? So, but assuming that question was silent on the risk management committee and there was an audit committee, then those issues of risk management would have to be dealt with by the audit committee. Right? So here it says, unless expressly addressed by a separate board risk committee. And then reviewing, I'm just flagging up some key ones, reviewing and monitoring the external auditor's independence and objectivity. Obviously, if we're going to bring PwC to be the external auditor, then we want to be sure that PwC will be objective, especially if PwC is getting non-audit fees from the company, which tends to be the case, where you get the bulk of your money. So PwC, accounting firms, they don't make their money from the audits. They make their money from all the ancillary services, consultancies, IT, and all that. And that has been the real tension, isn't it? The real tension that you have people who basically are making so much money, and therefore they're not truly independent. And so one way we've tried to deal with this is to get the audit committee involved in the appointment of the external auditor. B, to limit how long an external auditor remains. Previously, these guys spent, there was one case 20 years, but now it's 5 years. We could renew it for another 2, right? So maximum of 7. I see you nodding. Is that the same in Korea? Okay, yeah. It's Tesco recently had some financial problems, and I think that it was a Deloitte who, either Deloitte or KPMG, I can't remember who their auditors were now, and they had been there for over 10 years, right? But this was under the old code. So that's something that the audit committee will be looking into. And then, so if you notice here, it says developing and implementing policy on the engagement of the external auditor to supply non-audit services, right? Because that's the big issue, right? To ensure that independence is not compromised. And then what I've then done here is just give you a snapshot of the paper which I have uploaded. That's the FRC Guidance on Audit Committees, which was issued in April 2016. So if you look through, it's simply a guide, right? So it's not like you necessarily need to follow it, but it's a guide on how to implement the code on corporate governance. And essentially, what it then says is that the overall responsibility for risk management lies with the board. However, the audit committee plays a role, right? And so you see this here. So the idea basically is not to water the role of the board. Again, how do we do this? How do we play around with this? If we take this section, right, and think about the problem question of last week. There you had a board, and then you had a risk management committee, which had failed, right? Do we then stop analysis at the point of the risk management committee and say, oh, they failed, they're the ones in trouble? Or do we go back to the board and say, but you had residual authority? Remember, we talked about the Barings case, remember? And when I discussed Barings, I said, you can delegate, but residual responsibility lies with you. Now, I was just working from case law to reach that proposition. But what we now see is the Code on Corporate Governance, or rather its associate document, i.e. the guidance document, is reflecting this. It's saying that while all directors have a duty to act in the interest of the company, the audit committee has a particular role to ensure that the interests of company shareholders are properly protected, blah, blah, blah. And the board has overall responsibility for the organization's approach to risk management and internal control. So what this guidance is doing is confirming the statement in Barings. So please, if you are faced with a problem question and the audit committee or risk management committee has neglected its role, analysis does not stop there. You need to ask the question, what about the board? Right? And then notice, an audit committee is only as effective as the resources it has and the information it has. So if management does not give the audit committee information, then it's not very effective. And here what it's saying is that management is under an obligation, right, executive management, they're under obligation to ensure that the audit committee is properly informed, and therefore they should take the initiative in supplying information. Then, again, you see the same thing here. The members of the audit committee should bring an independent mindset to their role. And then you see that it talks about financial experience, right, which we've flagged up. And then, again, what I've done in looking at the guidance, I had in mind, what would be useful to you practically, especially, I hate to use the word exams. I always think of practice, right? But exams are sort of practice without being paid. So obviously, if you're dealing with a question, you want to look at how often did the audit committee meet, right? did the audit committee meet regularly? So here, and it's kind of fluid, right? It's fluid. Because sometimes, you know, you get problem questions where they would say, well, the audit committee only met 3 times a year. And people say, oh, no, these guys were not effective. They were only meeting 3 times a year. Actually, there's no problem with meeting 3 times a year, because that sort of coincides with key points in the company's financial cycle within the year. So, and I think, and here you see that the code, or rather the guidance document, talks about this. It says there should be as many meetings as the audit committee's role and responsibilities require. I think that's the key thing. It is what do you require, right? But there's a minimum of about 3, but we need to look at what it requires. And then again, it says the need for the audit committee to engage with the external and internal auditors. So when you think about the audit process, remember again where we're coming from. Please just remember the central problem is informational asymmetry. All right, that's the key problem. And the question is, how do we solve this key problem? Right? How do we solve the key problem? We solve it with financial reporting, which has integrity, and narrative reporting with integrity. Right? And for financial reporting, it is crucial to think in terms of the internal audit, the external auditor, and the audit committee. Corporate governance deals with the audit committee. That's why we're talking about this. The external audit is largely a creature of company law. All right? So if there are breaches of that, we talk about the law. But now we're just talking about corporate governance, which, as I've always said, is a system of apps, right? As a system of ex-ante apps to make the board, to make the company highly effective. So this is what we're basically saying. Again, here it says the audit committee should be provided with sufficient resources to undertake its duties. So to give you an example, you know, remember I've always said, you know, company law is the hardware. Company law doesn't talk about the audit committee. Maybe now we kind of mention it tangentially. But certainly company law does not say anything about funding of the audit committee. Right? It doesn't say it, right? So that's just the hardware. It just says, well, have an external auditor. Right? And then we then have a different system. So we have a system of company law which engrafted upon, we have the, you know, I was thinking about iOS or Android or whatever, which basically says, well, have this committee called an audit committee and resource them. Now, I think it's not rocket science that a company which does that is more likely to be more effective than a company which simply complies with the statutory duty in company law of just having an auditor. And then look at this bit. The board should make funds available to the audit committee to enable it to take independent legal, accounting, or other advice. All right? I'll just stop here for the minute, but and to get some feedback. You know, the devil is always in the detail. So, you know, sometimes when I look at certain financial disasters that occur abroad, and people always say, oh, there's a corporate governance issue, it's so clear to me sometimes where the problem lies. So there are problems in financial statements, and then people start talking about the audit committee. But the audit committee has no money, right? Because the system hasn't, created, has not designed the system with that level of specificity, right? It's not that specific. So every system on the planet now, they all have codes on corporate governance, right? So there'll be a general code on corporate governance, which talks about an audit committee. But the copying stops at that point, right? They don't know that in London, we also have a guidance document, which is not part of the code, right? But which we apply in working in using the code, which then goes on to tell us how the audit committee should work. So if you copy the code, but not the guidance document, and you don't give the audit committee money, right, then it's not going to work. Because these things tend to be complex. They tend to involve matters of complexity. And you can be sure that management will not volunteer the cash. Why would they volunteer the cash? Does anybody have any questions so far? Yeah.
As I know, the audit committee is one of the subcommittee of the board. But who should they report to and to keep their independence? So as I know, it's generated by the board, but if they report to the board, they lose their independence.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. So I don't think they lose their independence. I mean, it's a really fascinating question, by the way. But I don't think they lose their independence because, in a sense, what they, we start out by assuming, right, that the board is comprised of angels, but just misinformed angels, and the bad guys are management. Right? Remember the problem of managerialism, right? So remember, under our model, the board are the good guys. That's why they have a duty to monitor, right? So in order to monitor, they rely on the audit committee. So if the audit committee then tells the angels, the good guys, that that's where the bodies are buried, then we will not say that they lose their independence, right? Now, but however, I know. But we all know, right? We all know that sometimes the board is crooked. The board has failed. Then in that case, the audit committee reports directly to the shareholder. And that's why I referred you to the statement by Convitec. Notice, this is a report not of the board. This is a report of the audit committee. It's reporting directly to the shareholder. It's saying our key role is to ensure the integrity of the company's financial reporting and the effectiveness of its audit and risk management processes. And see, it's saying, dear shareholder, this is what we found, right? Right? And you see the level of detail. It talks about new members coming in, the induction, key areas of responsibility, financial reporting, right? Internal audits, right? So it's talking about its plan and the areas covered. Then the external audits, internal controls, risk management, fraud and whistleblowing, right? And then it then even talks about how to appoint new auditors, the tendering process to ensure that there is independence. And it talks about it has to also be sure that the external auditors are effective, right? So they have to be independent. They have to be. They shouldn't be there for too long. So there's the whole section on the external effectiveness of the effectiveness of the external audit. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So they don't lose their independence. But thanks for the question. I thought it was very important. So, so here, we're talking here about the relationship with the board. So here we see that it's working with the board. So the audit committee should report to the board. There may be areas of differences that they may be able to iron out, but obviously if they haven't, then obviously that will form part of its report. So it's not in the interest of the board, right, for you to allow your audit committee say something that the board is not happy with, right? So okay, and then here again I talk about roles and responsibilities, then here I talk about the internal audit process. Remember when I talked about the internal audit process, I said not every company will have an internal auditor, right? Big companies, yes. Small companies, no. The external audit, most companies will have an external auditor unless it's, it's a small company or a dormant company. Remember? I talked about that. So here, I'm assuming that the internal audit would apply, right? I said, so here I say the need for, so it's not me saying this, by the way, it's the FRC document. The need for an internal audit function will vary depending on company-specific factors, right? So like size and all that. So in the absence of an internal audit, then the audit committee really plays a higher role, right? Because now the audit committee, although the audit committee is not preparing the financial documents, it's almost like playing the role of an internal auditor, right? At the end of the day, the responsibility for the financial statements, for producing the financial statements, has to be that of management, right? And then here I talk about the external audit process. So as you read this section, again, as you read this section, remember that the external audit process described here by the Financial Reporting Council is based on the statutory framework, right? So the law tells us we have to have an auditor, an external auditor. The law tells us how to appoint. The law tells us about independence. Here it is simply just telling us about how that process works. And I'm not going to repeat it here because it's pretty straightforward, right? And as well as the annual audit cycle. So, so I'll stop here for the minute. Does anybody have any questions so far? Yeah.
What is the relationship between the audit committee and the board of supervisors? I mean, if the board of supervisors are authorized to...
when you say board of supervisors,
yes.
Who do you mean? What do you mean? Who are you pointing to?
I mean, if the board of supervisors are...
Not the board of directors.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No, when you said board of supervisors, I was... Oh, okay, I see. Oh. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So, okay, board of directors, yeah.
If they are authorized to supervise the financial position of their company.
If they're authorized to...
supervise the financial position of the company, and what the differences between the function of the supervisors and the audit committee?
Yeah, so here, okay, this is what I dealt with here. Obviously, subject to the statutory provisions, which I will talk about. Right. So the audit committee should report to the board on how it has discharged its responsibilities. Right. So there's a reporting function to the board. We talked about that. And I was talking about a situation where you may not be able to resolve issues with the board, right? Presumably, when you report to the board, there will be a common understanding, and everybody sings with one voice. Where there's disagreement between the audit committee and the board, adequate time should be made for discussion with a view to resolving the disagreement. Right? And I said most times that would be the case. However, there may be situations where the audit committee and the board are not able to resolve it, right? Which is perhaps at the heart of your question. And I said, because when you talk about the relationship, right, it's easy to talk about the relationship if you resolve issues, right? So simply say all you do is report to the board and you resolve. You inform the board, right? But the issue would be where you report to the board and you're not able to resolve issues. Then in that case, you have a reporting line to shareholders, right? And that's why I talked about the Convatec report. So here it says where any such disagreement cannot be resolved, the audit committee should have the right to report the issue to shareholders as part of the annual report. And that's why we saw the report of the audit committee in Convatec to the shareholders, right? And then once you report to the shareholders, then the market takes note of this. Does that answer your question? Right, okay. Now, but remember, it's not going to be often that you will find significant differences between the board and the audit committee. I was looking at the Tesco one. After the Tesco fraud, or is it fraud, misstatement, whatever, I went back to, and I was thinking about sending it to you, but I thought it was too much, right? It's about 140-something pages, but the key pages are between page 15 and 62, and I just thought even that was a lot. But what I was doing was this. I was looking at the report of the directors and the audit committee at the time when the fraud had occurred, but before it became public. So my aim was to find out, what did the audit committee say? Did they spot it? What did the external auditors say? Did they spot it? And what did the board say, if those groups said anything? And interestingly, the audit committee and the external auditors, especially the external auditors more than the audit committee, had flagged up an area of risk. There was a certain scheme, a kind of voucher scheme that had been rolled out, and the accountant said, we have concerns about this, that this could be an area of weakness. So they pointed this out, and the board then responded to this in their annual report to say, well, we take on board what the accountants are saying, but we don't think it's a problem, right? And in fact, in the end, that's where the problem came from, right? So when you look at the fraud, it actually came from that. And then, so when people were, challenging and critiquing the accountants had effectively covered their back. They raised it in a way that it was kind of woolly, but they raised it and were prepared to accept the assurances of the directors, right? And therefore, they protected themselves, right? So, because initially, I think there was a big clamor for the heads of the accountants, but usually, the accountants always get off, and so they did. And I think one person already has gone to jail as a result of this. Right? So you tend to get these kinds of things, right? Okay. Okay. So do you think you can, in a sense, you're clear about the role of financial reporting, at least from the audit perspective, in corporate governance? Remember, the big issue I want you to keep in your mind is the informational asymmetry. That's really the big issue, and it's ultimately, corporate governance is really about that, right? It's about how to solve this problem of informational asymmetry. And to the extent that we say that directors should give an account of their stewardship through the general meeting, the annual general meeting, whether they like it or not, by law, they're required by law to give an account once a year at the AGM. And therefore, if you give an account at the AGM, the idea is that these reports and these financial information should be before the shareholders, and it should not be tampered with. There should be integrity. So corporate governance is about all the processes designed to ensure that they remain effective. And therefore, it's a powerful tool of corporate governance. Right? That's the bottom line. Now, so we've been talking about the apps. What about the law, the hardware? Right? So basically, Section 393 of the Companies Act tells us that financial statements must give a true and fair view. What are the financial statements? Your P&L, right? Your balance sheet should give a true and fair view. And so the question is, what is a true and fair view? I mean, in your jurisdictions, what would be the equivalent of that statement, a true and fair view? What would be the equivalent? I'm thinking about systems that, say, civilian legal systems, certainly non-common law systems. What would be the equivalent of a true and fair view? Because presumably there must be a standard. And what would that be? Someone was telling me that in Italy there's something called evidenza verita. I'm sure I've mutilated the pronunciation. Evidenza de verita. Evidenza, so the yes, and verita, truth. That actually is the basically it means straightforwardness and truth. That would be the equivalent. So what would be the equivalent be?
I didn't understand the question, to be honest. Can you repeat the question, please?
Okay. So every legal system has to have a standard of truth. To which we measure financial statements. So I give the example of Italy, and I think it's and I'm sure every other legal system would have this. There must be some standard somewhere. So maybe in your civil code, when I came across this, it was, I think, Article 2217, Section 2 of the Italian Civil Code has this standard, right? And I'm sure this would apply in every other legal system. And what I was just trying to do was to make a connection between the standard we have here, which is the true and fair view standard, and whatever standard you have elsewhere. I may have mutilated the pronunciation, but I think I got the building blocks. I knew that it's about evidence, material evidence, and veritas, about truth.
Yeah, no, just what I know about this one, that for this kind of aspect, required standard that are higher, because usually in the book of obligation to act in a true and fair way, just need the true or fair way, we say, of a father of a family, in terms of obligation. But when you have this kind of situations where is required high skills, in this case, the true and fair that you have to use to analyze the financial statement, and the standard of director should be higher than the usual standard.
Okay.
That's what I would say, yeah.
Okay. Any other system? Any other in China? What do you use?
I think I checked it, just true and fair in Chinese words.
Okay, in Chinese. Okay. It's so. Anyway, the point here is that this is the standard we use, right? And the reason I mentioned this and how it affects everything we do. And by the way, you can override it. There's certain situations where you can say, well, it may not be true and fair as defined here, but there'll be a basis to override this. But let's look at what this means. And this is one case, this is one area where a legal opinion, right, written by lawyers, now became so authoritative, right? So Hoffman, who later went to the House of Lords, and Mary Arden, they were lawyers. And so the question was asked them, what do you think true and fair view means? And they wrote this legal opinion. And somehow this legal opinion became so authoritative, cases then cited it, and everybody was now. And you see in the Makara case, you see the court talking about it. So here we say, on this issue, a joint opinion written by these guys has been highly influential and relied upon, right? And it was in general circulation in the 80s. It has left an imprint on judicial thinking and legal writing. Who wouldn't like to write that kind of opinion, right? And the thesis is that the concept of true and fair view, which we see in the Companies Act, is an abstraction. So they basically say, essentially what they're saying is, it is for the courts to work out what is true and fair. It is for the courts to work out. However, there are many ways you can look at this. It's basically establishing the hegemony of lawyers over accountants who always compete with us to take work, right? And but then, because we don't know the ideas, we still say, well, we can still look at what the accountants say, right? So we are the ones who decide, but we'll look at what the accountants say, right? And that way, it's a win-win for everybody. That's me being cynical. But basically, it's saying we decide on the basis of guidance supplied by accountants. So it's saying here, we look to the courts. However, in deciding this question, the courts look for guidance to ordinary practices of accountants and standards published by the relevant professional body. I'll give you an example. I was talking about distributable profits a while ago. The Companies Act tells us in section 831 about the whole idea of distributable profits. Tells us about distributable profits. But how do you work this out? You have to turn to the accountants, right? Because the accountants will tell you when a profit has come about, right? And whether it is a realized profit. So the very idea of distributable profits, i.e. profits that you can distribute, the law says for it to be distributable, it has to be a realized profit. But what exactly is a realized profit? The law doesn't tell us what a realized profit is. You turn to statements by the accountants. You basically consult UK GAAP, UK General Accounting Principles to work out what a realized profit is, right? So imagine, you do counter trade, right? So you sell wheat in exchange for oil, right? Have you made a profit? If you don't have cash, is it realized? Now the accountants have clear standards. I'm sure with bitcoins also, right? With all that volatility, when do you have a profit? The accountants have these standards. It's not the lawyers working this out, it's the accountants. And the accountants always issue a document called the Urgent Issues Task Force reports, right? Urgent Issues Task Force report, which basically provides high-level conceptual thinking, right? On issues of measurement, right? On issues of measurement. So my point, therefore, is that what this document is saying is, it does make sense. It is saying that the courts will decide on the basis of accounting standards. Right? Therefore, compliance with professional standards is prima facie evidence that the accounts give a true and fair view of the assets and liabilities of the company or the group. So where you have a practice of booking to revenue prematurely, and most accountants say you do not book a sale to revenue prematurely because people return stuff, right? So you book to revenue after a certain number of days, eh? Then we would say your accounts do not give a true and fair view, right? Okay? And if your accounts do not give a true and fair view, then that will have severe consequences. So hopefully the external auditor will pick up on this, and certainly the audit committee would have picked up on this, and would then be able to tell the board that your CEO and your chief financial officer, they are cooking the books. And if we pay out a dividend, right, on this basis, when your accounts do not give a true and fair view, the board will be exposed to liability. Then at that point, the board would say, no, we don't want to deal with this kind of risk because we are the ones who will end up paying. Do you see? That's how it works. Right? So this basically, so in terms of preparing accounts, you know, every company has individual. Yeah, sorry.
If the directors have to pay back the dividend that they already paid out, is it under a duty of 172 to 174, or is it under special provision?
Yes, good question. The duty is part of the common law, right? So the duty is part of the common law. It's not under any special provision. And that arises because we say that directors are trustees of the company's property. So if they pay out a wrongful dividend, then they've misapplied trust funds, right? So if you've misapplied trust funds, then you have a duty, right, in equity, as a trustee who has paid out, you know, trust funds wrongly, to restore it. If you need the case law, it's a case called Selangor and Craddock, Towers and African Talk. But please, no need for the cases. They're not important, right? We're not dealing with that, right? It's just because there's a statutory provision, but it doesn't apply to directors. The statutory provision applies to those shareholders who keep the dividend with knowledge. So if I knew that the dividend was wrongfully paid, then I have a duty to return it, right, if I had knowledge. But in most cases, I won't have knowledge. So, and that's why in my example, you know, the shareholders were the ones who came up tops because the shareholders collected the wrongful dividend first, which they kept in their pockets, and then cost the directors to pay another set of dividends, which they could keep. Right? Okay. So, the true and fair view standard will apply to the preparation of individual accounts, group accounts, and information to be given in the notes to accounts. And of course, the signing and approval of accounts, right? Where the directors become bound to the accounts, right? And then on narrative reporting, I say recall the strategic report. So you go back to the beginning when I talked about the strategic report and look at the BAE statement, right? To see some of the elements of the strategic report. And then the audit process, remember the audit process by law is prescribed in the Companies Act. And here what I said, note, we are not here concerned with the Companies Act's detailed provisions on auditors, right? If I were concerned with that, I'll give you a chapter in Gower. That's not what we're concerned with. We're really concerned on the corporate governance issues, or with the corporate governance issues. And I said these are addressed by the code and the guidance earlier considered, which address the relationship between the directors and the external auditors. Having said that, you certainly would like to know a few things, such as which companies must have an auditor, who may be an auditor. Some of these questions were raised earlier, and we talked about them. And how do you appoint an auditor? And here I basically flag up PIEs So any company listed on a market would be a PIE, and basically you can see here it's saying that a PIE is an issuer whose transferable securities are admitted to trading on a regulated market, right? So any listed company. So basically it's saying the shareholders have to be involved in the appointment of the auditor, right? So shareholders here, by ordinary resolution, directors can appoint for a temporary period, and then Secretary of State can also appoint under certain circumstances, right? So essentially you can see that what the Companies Act is saying is this, that yes, the Code on Corporate Governance, tells us that, okay, there should be a nomination committee, right? A nomination committee that would suggest, an auditor and all that, but the appointment has to be by the shareholders, because ultimately the external auditor is there to protect the shareholders, right? He's there to watch out for the shareholders. He's not the friend of the directors. He's not. If the directors are the friend of the external auditor, then it's not going too well, right? You need somebody who will be somehow antagonistic to the directors, and hence the shareholders basically appoint. And then there's auditor liability limitation agreements, which I just mentioned, which basically allows, because of the risk of liability, the accountants were able to argue, or rather use their powers there to lobby for a limitation to their liability, so long as it is fair and reasonable, right? So, does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Because I have noticed some essays said that auditors and directors may introduce or invite auditors to their companies. So to some extent, maybe they know each other before. So I wonder, is it efficiently for auditors to audit the company?
Well, when you say invite, what do you mean? I mean,
they may know each other before.
yeah, okay, yes.
They
But
may be friends.
well, but then we expect the audit committee to supervise that, right? So here, the audit committee, right? Look at this bit. So the audit committee should have primary responsibility for the appointment of the auditor. Now, it doesn't mean that they're the shareholders appoint, right? But it just means they supervise that. So negotiating the fee, scope of audit, tender process, influencing the appointment of the engagement partners, basically overseeing the process to ensure that the auditor is independent. Did you see? So maybe that answers your question, right? So yes, they may know. I mean, think about it. How many big auditors are there in the country? So you're going to know. So we're not asking people to live in some unreal world of detached altruism, right? Conflicts is a part of life, right? It's really a matter of how you manage it, right? Okay, so thanks.
So can I ask you, in accordance with the schedule of module, we have 3 more topics, but only 1 week.
No, what we've done, I would send a note, because there was a topic. There are some changes I've made with Nigel to the scheme, right? So there's something I'm bringing up and something I'm dropping. The market for corporate control, for instance, is something.
I mean, we have minority aggression, we have derivative crimes, and institutional investors in schedule.
Yeah. So what I'm doing is I'm making changes to that. You'll see that in your next document. So I'm making changes. I'm not necessarily following that, because obviously I can't do everything. Right? So I'm making changes to that. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, so it's going to be about minority shareholder protection. Yeah. So and then I'm collapsing derivative claims than other forms of minority shareholder protection.
Yeah, I was not sure about that one. So the Italian translation assurance is true and correct, which is quoted with Italian law requiring straightforward evidenza a verità.
Oh, so it's correct.
Yeah, it was
Okay, okay, good.
Yes, no, because it's a flexible terms, and even also
Okay.
This part of the balance sheet taken into consideration by accountants. So, I used to work with every time we had to manage the disaster, we had external accountant.
No. Which is entirely correct. And I think my aim was just to show the link.
In order to understand how, because on this article that I was going through by Oxford University Press, I noticed that even though the concept is the same, some